Hello and welcome back to this third lecture on the photo exhibit Mega Seoul for Decades. I am Dr. Christina Han, Associate Professor of History at Laurier Bradford. It is a great exhibit. If you're in Ottawa, you can visit the exhibit in person at the Korean Cultural Center. Or if you're in Brantford like me, or in Waterloo, or anywhere else in the world, you can visit our virtual reality exhibit by clicking the link provided on the Korean Cultural Center webpage. As always, I am very happy to meet you, and I'm really excited about today's lecture. I hope you are too. So let's get right into it. Have you experienced a rapid transformation? The reality is changing so fast that you cannot keep up. Have you ever lived near a construction site or in an area undergoing a rapid development? Canada's cities are fast transforming. High-rises are coming up everywhere. My family moved from Toronto to Richmond Hill in my final year of high school, and this is what Highway 7 looked like when we first moved to Richmond Hill. We could see farms on both sides of Highway 7. But in the span of about 10-15 years, Richmond Hill completely changed, and this is what Highway 7 looks like now. 8 car lanes. It went through a rapid spatial transformation. Downtown Toronto transformed into a condo forest, and now condos are springing up in Brantford as well, very close to our campus, in fact. High-rises are expanding everywhere. How does this expansion of cities across Canada make you feel? Do you feel excited? Do you feel sad? Or do you feel worried? In the previous 2 lectures, we discussed the breathtaking transformation Seoul underwent in the past 5 decades, since the end of the Korean War. How Seoul went from post-war ruins like this to a city of high-rises. And how long this transformation take? Just 30 years. From a third world country to a tiger economy to a global exporter in just 30 years. In this process, Seoul went from a heap of ruins to a mega city. Seoul underwent a truly rapid transformation, the kind that would make you feel confused and disoriented, but at the same time also excited, because everything was changing all the time. This breathtaking urbanization was not unique to Seoul alone. Most of the world's megacities became megacities in the past few decades. Take a look at this photo of New York City. Urbanization is a global process, the one that we are experiencing in Canada also. In 2008, for the first time in human history, the majority of the world's inhabitants lived in cities rather than countryside. The world has become truly urban. We have seen striking development of large cities, megacities, Seoul being one of them. In this lecture, we are going to explore photographs of Seoul by 5 Korean artists who documented Seoul's rapid development. As we'll see, instead of showing the new and modern and urban images of the city, these artists chose to capture all that was quickly disappearing as a result of dizzying urbanization, as well as the people who were being displaced in this process. This connects back to the tradition of documentary photography we examined in our second lecture, how throughout history, photography was used to reveal various social problems, to raise awareness, and to bring about social reforms. The 5 artists we are going to look at in this lecture also focused on capturing everyday life of ordinary people, even more so, of the marginalized people. The title of my lecture today is this: The Costs of Development, the Lost, the Strange, and the Surreal. What do I mean by that? Well, let's find out. Let's first talk about the kind of development, redevelopment, and urbanization that Seoul went through in the past 4 decades. We discussed in Lecture 1 that during the Korean War, Seoul was evacuated and destroyed, and left it as a depopulated ruin until the end of the war in 1953. What happened when the war ended? Well, people came back, all at once. The influx of refugees at the end of the war meant that the city had to be rebuilt fast. Really fast, because people needed places to live in. The result was that Seoul quickly became a city of poor construction with unplanned and often inappropriate land allocations. Overcrowded slums sprang up all across the city. Then there was a post-war population explosion. The rapid economic development gave rise to the concentration of population in cities throughout South Korea, especially to an explosive expansion of population in Seoul. Between 1966 and 1978, in the span of 12 years, population of Seoul went from 3.79 million to 7.82 million. It almost doubled in 12 years. At an average increase of 1/3 per year. Imagine the chaos. Municipal administration was trying desperately to cope. Problems with traffic, land, housing, and environmental pollution accumulated endlessly. To accommodate this rapidly growing population, residential building projects were created, but they were often poor and rushed construction. A few apartment buildings, in fact, collapsed, including this one, KWON apartment that collapsed in 1970, which killed 34 people and injured 40 people. We are reminded of the recent tragedy of the condo building in Miami that collapsed. After these incidents, the government then began the construction of civic apartments with better safety measures, and also conducted safety inspection of existing civic apartment buildings and demolished unsafe ones. Seoul as a city experienced two types of collective residential renewal program throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. The first is a public residential redevelopment program, which involved clearing areas of residential squatters and substandard housing and building high-rise apartment complexes. The second program is a residential renewal program, which involved replacing older apartments with newer apartment buildings. The government also tried to more evenly distribute population throughout Seoul and develop the so-called underdeveloped areas. See this map that shows the expansion of Seoul. During the Joseon and colonial periods, north of the Han River was the more developed area because the royal palaces of the Joseon dynasty were located north of the river. Remember Bohnchang or North Town from our last lecture? In order to deal with housing crisis caused by exponentially growing population of Seoul, the government decided to develop south of the Han River and to build apartment buildings there. This led to the development of the Yeouido and Gangnam regions. Gangnam means south of the Han River. And these areas were called the New Town, and this development happened in the first half of the 1970s. This sounded like a great idea, except that this further accelerated population increase. Then the Gangnam region began to be filled with apartment buildings. And here is a close-up image of an apartment complex in Gangnam from the 1970s. The city could not keep up with the changes, which caused adverse side effects of giving rise to real estate speculation. The overexpanding and overpopulated Seoul suffered from new urban problems. One of them, traffic hell. Despite the new subway line, buses were jam-packed and there were so many cars. And what you're looking at here is a picture of a highway. Cars parked on a highway. And I remember as a kid, we would go on summer vacation, taking one of these highways, and cars would literally park on the highway for hours, and people would get out of their vehicles and picnic on the highway. Those were the good old days. I don't want to repeat those experiences, but yes, certainly I remember that from my own childhood experience. Also, schools could not keep up with the growing number of students. Classrooms with more than 70 students were very common in Seoul at the time. I grew up in Seoul in the 1980s. My classes were huge and there were so many classes. And I remember as a kid, our teachers would sit the students based on their last name. So, right, like following the consonants in the Korean alphabet. And H, which is my last name, Han, happens to be the last consonant in the Korean alphabet, which meant that I had to sit all the way at the back of the classroom. And I wasn't very tall, and I didn't think it was all that fair. But again, a good old childhood memory. Despite these massive construction projects, the householding rate of Seoul in 1975 was 58%. But more than half of Seoul's households in reality were the homeless masses. Many households lived in shanties. Municipal apartments were built, but they were so badly built using toxic materials. Land brokers and investors began buying land in the hope of earning huge profits. Some farmers and investors, in fact, became overnight billionaires of Gangnam. So here we have a newspaper advertisement of a newly built apartment complex in 1978. So by the time we get to this point, land prices in Seoul increased by how many times? 60 times over 15 years. Imagine land prices increasing by 60 times over 15 years. In the Gangnam region, the increase was even more crazy, 170 times. And this led to this rapid growth of Gangnam and increasing urban middle class in that area, which led to the transformation of Gangnam as a center of new wealth and commercial culture. The satire of which we see in South Korean pop star Psy's Gangnam Style, a song that went viral around the globe in year 2012. I hope you remember the horse dance. I'm not going to perform it for you, but probably you could watch the music video again now that you have this historical background, knowledge of the development of the Gangnam region. Fueling such rushed development of Seoul was the high economic growth of Korea between 1966 and 1979, often called the miracle on the Han River. Take a look at this graph that shows the GDP growth of South Korea, and you'll notice between 1960 and 1970 and moving on, the graph really goes up very rapidly. But this miracle was built on development dictatorship, where the growth was achieved through strict control and the development was sustained through oppression. And much of this miracle happened under the leadership of President Park Chung-hee, who was assassinated in 1979. His famous motto was this: "We can do it! Let's get wealthy!" Yes, he believed if people put their willpower together, they could accomplish anything. Sure, he did accomplish a lot, or under his dictatorship, South Koreans accomplished a lot. But many, many workers in Korea suffered terribly, while some others became wealthy and joined the urban middle class. So imagine all these changes taking place as Seoul was being transformed from a city filled with poor housing and slums into a city of skyscrapers, super tall apartment complexes. How did these changes affect the people living in Seoul? This is the background of Seoul captured in the photos by the 5 artists we are going to look at today. Let's start with Kim Gichan. The dates are there for you from 1938 to 2005. Kim photographed changing faces of Seoul for over 30 years, especially the lives of marginalized people, their everyday life. When he died, he left over 100,000 rolls of films, which the family donated to Seoul History Museum. Kim started photography as a hobby, but was inspired by the lives of people in the back streets. Seoul during this time was undergoing rapid development. I'm talking about the 70s and 80s. And Gangnam and other areas were being transformed, driven by forceful urbanization and developmentalism. So he began photographing the cobweb of back alleys, the faces of fast-changing city of Seoul in the 1970s and 80s. Gosh, I love these photos. They're so precious. He said in an interview that he discovered an impoverished neighborhood of Seoul to be full of warmth and an intimate human feeling. It really felt like home to him. So he decided to make back alleys, back streets, the focus of his career as an artist. His photos, showcased in our exhibit, MEGA SEOUL for Decades, come from this particular collection, the Lost Landscapes series. In this collection, Kim documents Jamsil's transformation from a rural village to a busy urban apartment forest. In the photos, we see the rapid growth of apartment buildings. In an interview, Kim said the following: "The low hill from which the sun rose after morning stars disappeared vanished behind apartment buildings, and another hill behind which the sun set was crushed by monster-like machines." And he writes how on that day, watching this, he decided to chronicle the urbanization process of Jamsil and the surrounding neighborhoods. And this photo shows one of those hills that was crushed by monster-like machines to make way for a new apartment complex. Especially in the 1980s, when it was announced that Seoul would host the 1988 Summer Olympics, and the Olympic Stadium would be built in Jamsil, the area went through dramatic transformation. Old houses like the one that you see here was torn down to make room for new buildings, new apartment buildings, and other types of buildings. Notice this bizarre scene captured by Kim Gichan. Rice paddies in the foreground and apartment buildings so close in the background. And this was what Jamsil looked like back in the days. Take a look at this photo. What are these signs? These are real estate brokerage signs. Kim said in one of the interviews that with the land value of these neighborhoods surging, real estate agencies began to sprout up from the stretches of rice paddies and fields. And these changes looked so strange to him that he decided to photograph scenes from the back alleys, the back streets. In this photo, we see newly constructed apartment buildings and the banners that welcome the new residents into these buildings. What do you feel when you see this photo of an old farmer with a hoe looking at the apartment buildings just beyond the rice paddies? What could have been on his mind? As we know, the land that he was working quickly turned into site for new developments. The rice paddies before him also quickly gave way to apartment complexes. Although the process of Seoul's urbanization was an incredibly fast one, in Canada, we also experienced a similar kind of urban expansion as well. Farms being sold to developers for new residential areas. How do you feel when you see farms in Ontario disappearing? This article from CBC News, published in May this year, 2021, says Over the past 2 decades, Ontario lost farmland at a rate of 175 acres a day, the equivalent of 5 family farms each week. How do you feel about these new suburban developments? Areas with identical looking homes. Can we see any similarities when we compare these two photos? One of Ontario and one of Seoul. Kim Gichan's photos show us the lost landscapes of Seoul. Now, from the lost landscapes of Seoul, let's move on to look at the lost people of Seoul. This brings us to Kapchul Lee, who was born in Hapcheon and first came to Seoul after high school to go to college and study photography. As a young artist, Lee was inspired by the works of documentary photographer Robert Frank, whom we studied in our last video. And Lee wanted to capture the everyday life of the marginalized and impoverished people of Seoul. So how did Seoul feel like to him in the 1980s? Very alien. In his interview, he speaks about the alienness of urban life in Seoul in the 1980s and how Seoul still feels very alien to him. How many of you can relate to this? Do you feel big cities are alienating? So what did Lee do? He began taking pictures, lots of pictures, capturing his feeling of loneliness, his experience of living in Seoul alone, how he came to Seoul empty-handed. He had nowhere to stay. So he lived off his friends, even slept on park benches. And he said it was fun. Of course, he wished to be rich, but he felt like he was living in a land of strangers. He eventually took these snapshots taken between 1985 and 1990 and showcased them in his 2006 exhibit called The Land of the Others. The photos we have in our Mega Seoul exhibit come from this particular collection. So, what do they look like? Here is one from 1987. Seoul. It shows a photo of busily walking people, just showing their legs, and a perplexed face of a woman in an advertisement billboard. This photo shows office workers carrying identical looking black suitcases to work. Again, he's not showing their faces. And these scenes looked very strange to him, and that's why he took these photos. And this photo shows a homeless person sleeping on a staircase outside a locked building. That's what he noticed about Seoul. In this photo, we see office towers and a narrow sky that is visible above between the two office towers. We also see a movie theater and international flags. And this photo was taken in 1987, just before the 1988 Summer Olympics in Seoul. As you will notice, his photos of Seoul have strange angles, and it shows how Seoul was seen as the land of the others, and he, himself, and many others as outsiders. The 1988 Summer Olympics in Seoul was seen as a turning point, a critical moment, kind of like a coming out party for South Korea. And people in Korea thought this was such an important event, a chance to show the new and global face of the country to the world. I went to school. I grew up in Korea, in Seoul, throughout the 1980s. I went to school in 1988. I was 10 in 1988, so now you know how old I am. And just leading up to 1988, I remember as a child seeing this mascot, Hodori, a tiger, everywhere. He was everywhere on the streets, in the shops, at school. He was literally everywhere. And we sang the Olympic theme song at school every day. So we sang the national anthem. and the Olympic theme song. So it was supposed to be this big party for South Korea. Well, the party that South Korea was throwing for the rest of the world to join. But this photo of Hodori, taken by Lee, paints a very different picture of the Olympics. Hodori was supposed to be all cheerful, but in this photo, Hodori walks alone. He looks tired, while spectators are pushed to the sides of the streets. Who are the others? Where is the land of the others? Through his photos, Lee poses these difficult questions. He once said in an interview, "The society might have appeared more affluent and organized on the outside, but was still politically turbulent, confusing, and hostile to the have-nots. So in my mind," Lee writes, "Seoul was truly the land of strangers." Here's a photo of an old man in suit. Perhaps he just arrived in Seoul. He's standing before a car. The car's doors are wide open. Perhaps it's a taxi. But this old man in suit looks lost. He looks hesitant, as if he just arrived in the land of strangers. And that was the experience of Seoul for Lee and many others living in Seoul in the 1980s. Our third artist, Bohnchang KOO, in Korean KOO Bohnchang, also explored the theme of alienness of Seoul in his photographs of the city. KOO is a highly accomplished photographer and professor. He grew up in Seoul and studied photography in Germany for 6 years between 1979 and 1985. And when he returned to Seoul in 1985, he rediscovered the city because the city looked very different. 6 years was a long time for Seoul. A lot had changed during this time. And he writes, "After 6 years of living abroad and returning to Seoul, everything looked strange and different, and I felt the need to perceive and record all of it through my camera's viewfinder." These photos were later published under the collection titled Perspective 1980, and the photos we see in our exhibit today come from this particular collection. So what do these photos show? The experience of becoming a stranger in one's own hometown. He said Seoul looked strange, evocative, sorrowful, confusing. In this particular photo, he notices a young man standing by a colorful advertisement of a photo studio. He thought it looked strange, so he decided to take a picture of that man and that particular scene. In this one, he notices a truck, perhaps heading to a construction site, and above it, a giant billboard with colorful suit. In this one, he observes an open public area. Families are hanging out, and he stands outside the barricade observing what's going on. Perhaps he was thinking, that looks strange. Let's take a picture. In this one, he shows the University Road in Seoul that is blocked off with signs that say no bicycles and no motorcycles and no entry. Perhaps he thought, that looks really strange. Take another picture. This photo shows the back of a bus. Perhaps he took this photo because he didn't know where the bus was going. And I can totally relate to this photo because when I go back to Seoul, and I often do, I try to go back once every 2 years or so before COVID. But when I go back, I still feel like a stranger in my old hometown. So I could really relate to these photos. In fact, last year, I was in Seoul, back in Korea, for my brother's wedding. My brother got married in Seoul. So I had the opportunity to travel during the COVID-19 outbreak. So when I was in Seoul last year, my extended family decided to have this gathering. So we were supposed to meet in this restaurant. They told me where this place was. I got a cab and I told the taxi driver, take me to the Olympic Park, please. The taxi driver looked at me and said, which gate? I said, I have no idea. Which road should I take? I said, I have no idea. Oh, so after a couple of rounds of going back and forth, of course, my answer was, I don't really know because I'm not very good with directions and I didn't really know. He turned around and looked at me and asked me this question. He said, are you Korean? I told him I am Korean, but I am from Canada and I haven't lived here for long. So yeah, I actually don't know where I'm going. So feeling like a stranger? Right there for you. Another story of mine. Last year, I reconnected with a good friend from the past, the friend who lives in Korea. And this friend jokingly said to me that I speak Korean with a 1990s Seoul accent. I don't even know what that accent sounds like, but apparently I do sound different, which made me really sad, as if I'm still stuck in that time. Like, time stopped for me in 1994. I am going to make him watch this video and apologize to me again. Yeah, I do feel like a stranger in my old hometown in Seoul. Do you have a similar experience? So that was the strange in my lecture title. The lost, the strange. Now let's move on to the surreal. The next artist we are going to look at is AHN Sekwon. He was born and raised in Jeollabuk-do province, that's outside Seoul, until high school years, and he came to Seoul for education and better opportunities as a young man, right? Like the previous two artists we examined, on arriving in Seoul also felt this sense of alienation. In an interview, An describes how he came to Seoul to accomplish his dreams. Seoul brims with the aspirations and desires of its residents who have come to build a better future. The city's residents, including me, often compromise with irrationalities and endure and overcome reality. Seoul is a unique and interesting city where beautiful, heart-wrenching, and surreal events can be witnessed. There is one photo by him included in our exhibit, and it comes from his series called Seoul Newtown Landscapes, dated 2009. These are beautiful works. I absolutely love them. The Seoul An saw was a site of constant construction, development, and redevelopment. Living in Seoul, An felt close to neighborhoods that were soon to disappear, rather than the glamorous and modern parts of Seoul. He says that he began this work with a sense of duty to document what was disappearing for good. He describes his photos as temporary landscapes created by history, by time, and by humans. They are temporary, transient landscapes that appear and disappear, that bear people's memories. This photo, The Light of Wolgokdong, dated 2005, shows a landscape of this particular area in Seoul that was going to be redeveloped. As you can see, this area is still filled with lights. People are still living there. And this photo was taken in 2005. This photo, taken 2 years later, shows how much of the neighborhood is now gone, with only a few streetlights remaining. These are absolutely visually stunning. What do you feel when you look at these two images side by side? These are beautiful, metaphoric, surreal landscapes. He calls them surreal landscapes that capture vanishing, transient spaces, and how he documents the final moments of these places in Seoul. His works often reveal scenes of demolition and ruins, but the images are very peaceful and serene. Han said, perhaps it's because his works capture this ephemeral moment between the past and the future. The last artist that we are going to look at is Hyewon. She's a very fascinating artist, young artist, women artist. She was first trained in traditional Korean painting, and now she's a photographer. Born and raised in Seoul, like An, KEUM developed interest in documenting redevelopment and reconstruction sites all around Seoul, as well as spaces that are hidden from our everyday sight. Her collection, Urban Depth, exposes various hidden sites throughout Seoul. What do I mean by hidden sites? Such as garbage collection area in an apartment building to show what goes underneath the surface of urban living. 2 photos by her are on display in our exhibit, and they come from this series called Blue Territory, taken between 2007 and 2010. What is this photo showing? In an interview, KEUM said, pieces of blue tarpaulin, processed fabric used for the prevention of flooding in demolition sites, looked like curtains used for the magic show of turning dilapidated neighborhoods into luxurious apartment complexes. I wanted to visualize the voids and crevices left behind after this magical change swept through an area in a flash. What a beautiful description of what her work is about. In this photo, blue tarpaulin covers the ruins caused by demolition in redevelopment site. The artificiality of that color, blue, creates a surreal landscape. And by choosing to take pictures of the blue covers, the artist draws attention to the violence done to the land, the scars hidden behind the blue surface, and all that is lost as a result of redevelopment. Memories, people's lives, their homes, demolished, and now lying as ruins underneath the blue tarpaulin covers. The gigantic waterproof tarpaulins create temporary ponds like this one we see in this photo. KEUM writes how through these somewhat surreal images composed of exaggerated colors and expanded screens, she tried to paradoxically express the scars hidden behind the blue surface. We have now finished looking at the works by 5 artists that bring to light the lost, the strange, and the surreal images of Seoul's urbanization and redevelopment. I hope you enjoyed learning about them. I certainly enjoyed learning about these artists and sharing my reflections with you. Now, look at your own city. Whether you're in Ottawa or in Brantford, I am sure we can all find sites of redevelopment, like the disappearing farms we discussed early in this lecture. Are you inspired to take pictures of the places, the spaces that are disappearing? Images of the lost, the strange, and the surreal. I certainly am. Do you feel like a stranger in your own hometown or where you live right now? You're not alone. In fact, as someone once said, a city is where people feel lonely together. We are all in this together. In my final lecture, we'll look at apartment buildings. I have lots of amazing photos and interesting stories to share with you. So I hope to see you all in my final lecture for Mega Seoul for Decades.